Can I sit with you?
Yes, ma'am. Pull up a chair.
A dusty diner off Highway 40 goes dead silent when a frail, 70-year-old woman with a pronounced limp walks toward a table surrounded by leather-clad Hell's Angels. The tension is thick enough to cut with a combat knife. She doesn't cower. Instead, she looks the biggest, most heavily tattooed biker right in the eyes and asks, "Can I sit with you?" What followed wasn't a scene of intimidation or cruelty. It was the explosive beginning of a high-stakes standoff that would uncover a deadly secret, bringing a notorious outlaw motorcycle club and a desperate grandmother together in an unforgettable fight for survival. The heat radiating off the asphalt of Route 66 inches Barstow, California, was enough to melt the soles of a man's boots. It was mid-July, the kind of sweltering, oppressive afternoon that kept sensible people indoors, with the air conditioning cranked to the absolute maximum. But at Peggy's Crossroads Diner, the parking lot was packed. It wasn't filled with family sedans or tourist RVs. It was lined with heavy, custom-built Harley-Davidson motorcycles, their chrome gleaming viciously under the desert sun. Inside the diner, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of stale coffee, sizzling bacon grease, and the distinct scent of hot leather and exhaust. The local chapter of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club had claimed the entire back half of the establishment. 15 full-patch members sat crammed into the vinyl booths, laughing loudly, devouring plates of steak and eggs, and dominating the space with the sheer force of their presence. At the center booth sat Tommy Grizzly Callahan. Standing at 6'4" and weighing 280 pounds, Tommy was the sergeant-at-arms. His arms were sleeves of faded ink, chronicling a life lived entirely by his own brutal, unyielding rules. Across from him sat his closest brother in the club, Arthur Bulldog Lawson, a stocky man with a scar running from his ear to his jawline. The regular patrons of Peggy's Diner were huddled in the front booths, keeping their heads down, speaking in hushed whispers, and desperately trying to avoid making eye contact with the men in the back. Then, the small brass bell above the diner's glass door chimed. The sound was sharp, cutting through the low rumble of biker conversation. Heads turned. Through the door walked a woman who looked like she had just survived a war. Her name was Martha Higgins. She was 72 years old, dressed in a faded blue floral dress that hung loosely on her fragile frame. Her silver hair was disheveled, matted with sweat against her forehead. But it was her physical condition that drew the immediate, silent attention of every man in the room. Martha was limping heavily, dragging her left leg with every agonizing step as if her knee had entirely given out. Her breathing was shallow and ragged. Her knuckles were stark white as she clutched a worn, oversized leather handbag to her chest, holding it so tightly that her forearms trembled. Worse than her limp was the look in her eyes. It wasn't the look of an old woman lost on a road trip. It was the frantic, wide-eyed stare of a hunted animal. Martha scanned the diner. The front section was completely full of nervous locals. The only available seats were in the back, deep within the territory currently occupied by the Hells Angels. The waitress, a young girl named Sarah, stood frozen behind the counter, holding a pot of coffee, unsure of what to do. Martha took a deep breath, her chest rising shakily. With an agonizing slowness, she began to walk toward the back of the diner. The heavy thud drag of her orthopedic shoes echoed on the checkered linoleum floor. The bikers watched her approach. The laughter died down. The clinking of silverware stopped. Bulldog leaned back in his booth, crossing his massive arms, a look of sheer bewilderment crossing his scarred face. Tommy Callahan narrowed his dark eyes, watching the old woman navigate the narrow aisle between the tables of outlaws. She stopped right beside Tommy's booth. The silence in the diner was absolute. You could hear the ceiling fans whirring overhead and the buzzing of a lone neon sign in the window. Martha looked down at Tommy. Her hands were shaking so violently that her handbag tapped rhythmically against her hip. She swallowed hard, her throat clicking, and then she spoke. Her voice was raspy, barely more than a whisper, but in the dead quiet of the room, it carried perfectly. "Excuse me, young man," Martha said, looking directly into the eyes of the towering Hells Angel. "Can I sit with you?" Bulldog let out a low whistle. A few of the younger bikers at the adjacent tables shifted in their seats, waiting for Tommy to tell the old lady to get lost. Tommy, however, didn't immediately respond. He studied her. He noticed the deep purple bruising around her right wrist, the kind of bruise left by a violent, forceful grip. He noticed the dust coating her clothes, indicating she had been walking outside in the desert heat for a long time. And he saw the sheer, unadulterated terror swimming in her pale blue eyes. Tommy Callahan was not a soft man. He had seen things and done things that would make the average citizen's blood run cold. But he operated on a strict, personal code of respect. And looking at this frail, terrified woman, a deeply buried instinct flared to life in his chest. "Yeah," Tommy said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble. He slid his massive frame over on the vinyl bench, making room. "Take a load off, ma'am." Martha let out a breath that sounded like a sob of relief. She practically collapsed onto the bench beside the giant biker, her bad leg jutting awkwardly out from under the table. She kept her leather bag clutched tightly to her stomach. "Get her some water," Tommy barked at the waitress, who immediately snapped out of her trance and hurried over with a glass and a slice of that cherry pie, on my tab. "Thank you," Martha whispered, taking the glass of water with trembling hands and drinking it greedily. "Thank you so much." "You don't look like you're from around Barstow," Bulldog noted, leaning forward, his eyes dropping to the dark bruising on her wrist. "And you look like you've been running through hell wearing gasoline boots. What's going on, Grandma?" Martha set the glass down. She looked out the large plate glass window of the diner, staring out at the shimmering heat of the highway. "I am resting," she lied, her voice shaking. Just resting my leg." Tommy wasn't buying it. People don't drag themselves into a diner looking over their shoulder like the devil himself is chasing them just to rest a leg. "Somebody hurt you?" Before Martha could answer, the roaring sound of a heavy engine cut through the ambient noise outside. A massive jet-black SUV pulled off the highway and jerked violently into the diner's parking lot, its tires crunching loudly against the gravel. It parked haphazardly, boxing in 3 of the Harleys. Martha let out a sharp, panicked gasp. She shrank back into the booth, trying to make herself as small as possible behind Tommy's broad shoulders. "Oh God," she whispered, her voice cracking with pure despair. "They found me." The atmosphere inside Peggy's Crossroads diner shifted from tense curiosity to a dark, volatile hostility in a fraction of a second. Tommy's eyes flicked from the trembling woman beside him to the black SUV idling aggressively outside. He didn't need to be a detective to put the pieces together. The doors of the SUV opened. 2 men stepped out onto the sun-baked gravel. They were starkly out of place in the Mojave Desert. Both men were dressed in tailored, dark gray suits that screamed corporate wealth. But the way they moved, with a calculated, predatory grace, suggested they were something far more dangerous than simple businessmen. They didn't sweat in the heat. They didn't look around with the casual interest of travelers. Their eyes were locked dead on the front doors of the diner. "Friends of yours?" Tommy asked, his voice low, his eyes never leaving the 2 men as they approached the entrance. "Please," Martha begged, grabbing the sleeve of Tommy's leather cut with her bruised hand. "Please don't let them take me. They killed my boy. They'll kill me too." The words hit the table like a lead weight. Bulldog's jaw tightened, and he slowly reached down, unbuttoning the leather strap over his boot, where a heavy hunting knife rested. "Nobody is taking anybody anywhere," Tommy said softly, his eyes completely devoid of warmth. The diner bell chimed again. The 2 men stepped inside. The man in the lead, whom we will call David Briggs, was tall, with slicked-back dark hair and a flat, emotionless face. Behind him was a broader, heavier man named Arthur Sterling, whose thick neck and heavy brow betrayed a history of professional violence. David adjusted his cuffs and scanned the room. The local patrons in the front booth shrank into their seats, terrified of the sudden oppressive aura the 2 men brought with them. David's eyes swept past the counter, past the waitress, and finally landed on the back booths. He saw the sea of leather and denim. He saw the Hells Angels patches. And then, he saw a wisp of silver hair hiding behind the massive frame of the sergeant-at-arms. David smiled. It was a cold, utterly lifeless expression. He began walking down the aisle, his polished leather shoes clicking sharply against the linoleum. Arthur followed closely behind, his right hand slipping casually inside the breast of his suit jacket. As they walked deeper into the back of the diner, the bikers began to react. Men who had been casually leaning against the walls stood up straight. The ambient noise completely vanished. Chairs scraped against the floor as several large, heavily tattooed men shifted their weight, turning their bodies to face the aisle. They didn't draw weapons, but their posture was unmistakable. They were building a human wall. David stopped about 5 feet from Tommy's table. He looked at Bulldog, then down at Tommy, and finally at Martha, who was trembling so violently the table was shaking. "Martha," David said, his tone dripping with a faux, sickly sweet politeness. "You've been making us drive all over the desert. Your family is worried sick. It's time to go home now." Martha didn't speak. She just shook her head, tears finally spilling over her wrinkled cheeks, clinging desperately to her leather bag. "I think the lady's deaf, friend," Tommy said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand up. He just sat there, taking up space, projecting a mountain of immovable defiance. "Or maybe she just doesn't want to talk to you." David's cold smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He looked at Tommy, assessing him, calculating the threat. He saw the 1% patch. He saw the sergeant-at-arms rocker. "This is family business, gentlemen," David said smoothly, his eyes flashing with irritation. "The woman is suffering from severe dementia. She wandered off from her care facility in Barstow. We are here to safely escort her back. I suggest you let us do our jobs." "That's funny," Bulldog chimed in, his voice dripping with sarcasm. She seemed perfectly sharp when she asked for a slice of cherry pie. Didn't say a damn word about a care facility. Arthur, the muscles standing behind David, lost his patience. He took a heavy step forward, pulling his hand halfway out of his suit jacket. "Look, biker," Arthur growled, his voice a guttural rasp. "Hand over the old lady. Are going to get incredibly messy for you and your little motorcycle club." It was the absolute worst thing he could have said. In an instant, the diner erupted into synchronized, terrifying motion. Tommy stood up, his massive frame blocking out the sunlight coming from the window. Bulldog was on his feet, his hand resting casually but purposefully on his belt. All around the diner, 13 other Hell's Angels stood up simultaneously. The heavy thud of combat boots hitting the floor sounded like a drumline. Guns weren't drawn, but hands hovered over waistbands, under cuts, and near boot tops. The air in the diner felt as though it had been sucked into a vacuum. The sheer, overwhelming threat of extreme violence hung in the room like a physical fog. Tommy stepped out of the booth, placing himself directly between the two suited men and Martha. He looked down at Arthur, towering over him by 3 inches and outweighing him by 50 pounds. "You walked into the wrong room to make threats, suit," Tommy whispered, his voice dangerously soft. "You got exactly 5 seconds to turn around, walk out that door, and get back into your shiny black car. If you are still standing here on second number 6, my brothers and I are going to beat you until your own mother couldn't identify you with dental records." David put a hand on Arthur's chest, stopping him from doing something incredibly stupid. David was a professional. He looked around the room, doing the math. 2 men, no matter how well armed, against 15 hardened, enraged outlaws in a confined space. It was a suicide mission. "There's been a misunderstanding," David said, his jaw tight. He slowly backed up a step, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "We don't want any trouble with the club." 4, Tommy counted out loud. David's eyes darkened with a venomous hatred. He looked past Tommy, locking eyes with the terrified old woman. "This isn't over, Martha. You know what you have. You know what belongs to us." 2, Tommy said, taking a half step forward. David and Arthur turned on their heels. They walked briskly down the aisle, the Hell's Angels parting just enough to let them through, staring daggers into the backs of the 2 men. The diner bell chimed as they exited. Through the window, the bikers watched as the 2 men got into their SUV, but they didn't speed off toward the highway. Instead, the SUV slowly pulled across the street, parking in the dusty lot of an abandoned gas station, facing the diner. They were waiting. Tommy turned back to the booth and sat down heavily. The diner remained completely silent, the tension still vibrating in the air. He looked at Martha, who was staring at her trembling hands. "All right, Martha," Tommy said, his tone leaving no room for argument or evasion. "The wolves are at the door, and they ain't leaving. You're going to tell me exactly who those men are. what they want, and what you've got in that bag. The oppressive heat inside the diner felt heavier now, suffocating. Outside the window, the black SUV sat idling in the shade of the abandoned gas station's rusted canopy, a silent, predatory sentinel. Tommy signaled to the front of the diner. Two of the youngest members of the club, prospects looking to earn their patches, immediately moved to the front doors. They flipped the open sign to closed, pulled down the faded vinyl blinds, and locked the deadbolts. The regular patrons remained frozen in their booths, too terrified to speak, essentially becoming hostages to the unfolding drama. Tommy turned his full attention back to the fragile woman trembling in his booth. "Talk," he commanded, his voice rumbling from deep within his chest. "No more lies about resting your leg. No more fairy tales about dementia. Why are two professional hitmen parking across the street, waiting for a 70-year-old grandmother?" Martha took a shuddering breath. She looked around at the circle of imposing, leather-clad men standing guard around her. They were outlaws, dangerous men, by society's standards. But right now, they were the only wall between her and a shallow grave in the desert. She slowly opened her large leather handbag. The bikers instinctively tensed, hands drifting toward their weapons, but Tommy held up a hand, signaling them to hold steady. Martha didn't pull out a gun or a bomb. She pulled out a simple, wooden walking cane. It was ordinary looking, scarred and chipped near the bottom. "My grandson," Martha began, her voice cracking with raw grief. "His name was Leo Sullivan. He was a brilliant boy, good with numbers. Too good." She rested the cane across her lap, her bruised fingers tracing the smooth wood of the handle. "Leo got a job right out of college, working as a forensic accountant for a massive logistics and shipping firm operating out of Chicago. He was so proud. Bought me this house in Barstow so I wouldn't have to endure the winters anymore." A tear slipped down her cheek, splashing onto the faded fabric of her dress. But a year ago, Leo noticed discrepancies. Ghost shipments, shell companies, millions of dollars moving through accounts that didn't exist. Bulldog leaned forward, his scarred face tight with interest. "Money laundering?" "Worse," Martha whispered, her eyes dark with horror. "Human trafficking." The company was using its international shipping containers to move people. Leo dug too deep. He found the master ledgers, the routing numbers, the names of the politicians and customs officials they had bought off. He downloaded everything. Tommy crossed his massive arms, and let me guess, the company found out he was snooping. "He called me 4 days ago," Martha continued, her voice breaking into a sob. "He sounded frantic. He said he had taken the files. He said he was going to the FBI field office in Los Angeles, to a specific agent he trusted. But he told me that if anything happened to him, if he went silent, I had to be the one to deliver the evidence." She looked down at the wooden cane in her lap. With trembling hands, she gripped the rubber tip at the bottom and twisted. There was a faint click. She pulled, and the bottom 4 inches of the cane detached. The inside of the wooden shaft was completely hollowed out. From inside the cane, Martha slid out a small, black, encrypted USB flash drive. She placed it on the table between 2 empty coffee cups. "2 days ago, 2 police officers came to my door in Barstow," she said, weeping openly now. "They told me Leo was dead. They said his car went off a bridge into the Chicago River. A tragic accident." The diner was dead silent. The harsh reality of her words hung heavy in the air. "I knew it wasn't an accident," Martha said, her voice suddenly hardening with a fierce, grandmotherly resolve. "I packed a bag. I grabbed the cane he had mailed me weeks prior for safekeeping. But they were watching my house. Those men in the suits. They broke in yesterday morning. They grabbed me." She touched her bruised wrist. "They tore the house apart looking for the drive. I managed to slip out the back window when they were searching the basement. I've been walking the back roads since sunrise, hiding in the brush whenever a car drove by." Tommy stared at the small black drive resting on the Formica table. It was smaller than a lighter, but it carried the weight of a massive, deadly, criminal empire. "Why didn't you just go to the local cops?" Bulldog asked. "Leo told me not to," Martha replied, shaking her head frantically. "He said the syndicate owned people everywhere. Local police, judges. He said I could only trust Agent Miller at the federal building in Los Angeles. If I gave it to anyone else, The drive would disappear, and I would be killed. Tommy rubbed his bearded jaw, looking out through a slit in the blinds at the black SUV parked across the street. The men inside were likely calling for backup. 2 men had walked into the diner. A dozen more heavily armed cartel fixers could be an hour away. This was completely outside of club business. The Hells Angels had their own operations, their own codes, and their own wars to fight. Getting involved in a federal human trafficking case against a massive, well-funded syndicate was bad for business. It brought heat. It brought the feds. Logically, the best move was to put the old lady out the back door, hop on their bikes, and ride away, leaving her to her fate. But Tommy Callahan didn't run on pure logic. He ran on a code. He looked at Martha. He saw the exhausted, desperate slump of her shoulders. He remembered his own grandmother, a tough-as-nails Irish woman who had been the only person to visit him during his first stint in juvenile lockup. The only person who had ever believed he was worth a damn. She had died alone in a hospital while he was serving time. He hadn't been there to protect her. Tommy stood up. He grabbed the USB drive off the table and shoved it deep into the front pocket of his leather cut. "Bulldog!" Tommy barked, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "Yeah, boss? Get the boys ready. We're cutting our ride short. We ain't heading up to Vegas." Tommy looked down at Martha, extending a massive, calloused hand toward her. "Come on, Martha." "Grab your bag." Martha looked up at him, confused and terrified. Where are we going?" A grim, dangerous smile spread across Tommy's face. "You wanted to go to Los Angeles, didn't you? Well, it's your lucky day. You just hired yourself the biggest, meanest escort service in the state of California." Bulldog grinned, a wild, feral look in his eyes. He turned to the rest of the bikers in the room. "You heard the sergeant-at-arms. Mount up. We got a VIP to deliver to the City of Angels." The diner erupted into a flurry of organized chaos. Bikers grabbed their helmets, checked the magazines of their concealed weapons, and headed for the back exit leading to the parking lot. Outside, sitting in the air-conditioned cabin of the black SUV, David Briggs watched the front of the diner intently. His cell phone was pressed to his ear. "Yeah, we have a complication," David said coldly into the receiver. "The old woman is surrounded by a local MC chapter. Hells Angels. Send the extraction team down the I-15 corridor. Bring heavy hardware." Nobody walks away with that drive. Inside the diner, Tommy hoisted Martha to her feet, wrapping a protective, massive arm around her frail shoulders. The collision course was set. The desert highway was about to turn into a war zone. The transition from the stifling heat of the diner to the blinding glare of the Mojave sun was jarring. Tommy Callahan didn't hesitate. He led Martha Higgins by the arm, keeping his massive body positioned between her and the street where the black SUV was parked. "Put this on," Tommy ordered, tossing Martha a spare, heavy, Kevlar-lined riding jacket from one of his saddlebags. It swallowed her frail frame completely, but the thick material was better than nothing. He strapped a matte black half-helmet onto her head, securing the chin strap over her trembling jaw. "You hold on to my belt. You don't let go, and you don't look back. Understand?" Martha nodded, her pale blue eyes wide behind the helmet's visor. She swung her bad leg awkwardly over the passenger pillion of Tommy's heavily modified Harley-Davidson Road Glide. She wrapped her bruised arms tightly around his waist, gripping the thick leather of his belt with desperate strength. "Kick him over!" Bulldog roared. 15 heavy V-twin engines roared to life simultaneously. The sound was deafening, a mechanical thunderclap that rattled the plate glass windows of Peggy's Crossroads diner. Tommy dropped his bike into gear and twisted the throttle. The pack surged forward as one unified rolling beast, kicking up a massive cloud of desert dust as they hit the asphalt of Route 66, banking hard toward the southbound ramp of Interstate 15. Across the street, the black SUV's tires shrieked as David Briggs slammed on the accelerator, tearing out of the abandoned gas station. "They're moving," David barked into his phone, his steering wheel jerking as he forced the heavy vehicle onto the road in pursuit. "Southbound I-15. They're making a run for the city. Where is my extraction team?" 10 miles south of your position." The voice on the radio crackled. 2 intercept vehicles, armored. We will box them in at the Cajon Pass. The wind battered Martha as Tommy pushed the road glide past 90 miles an hour. The desert landscape blurred into a streak of brown and faded green. The Hells Angels rode in a tight, disciplined diamond formation. Tommy and Martha were dead center. Bulldog rode point, scanning the horizon, while 4 of the largest, heaviest bikes brought up the rear, acting as a motorized shield. For the first 20 miles, it was a high-speed chase through the barren wastelands. The black SUV stayed a quarter-mile back, pacing them, waiting for its backup. Tommy checked his mirrors constantly. The vibration of the road, the deafening roar of the exhaust, and the sheer terror of the situation made Martha press her face hard against Tommy's leather cut. She closed her eyes, praying to a god she hoped was watching over this chaotic stretch of highway. Then, the terrain began to change. The flat desert gave way to the treacherous, winding inclines of the Cajon Pass. The highway narrowed as it cut through the San Bernardino Mountains. "Company!" Bulldog yelled over the roaring wind, pointing ahead. Emerging from an emergency turnaround on the highway median were 2 massive, heavily modified tactical SUVs, painted matte gray. They merged aggressively onto the southbound lanes, directly in front of the biker pack, completely blocking the 2 left lanes. Simultaneously, David's black SUV accelerated from behind, closing the gap with terrifying speed. They were caught in a moving trap at 80 miles an hour. "Hold the line!" Tommy bellowed, his voice carrying over the engine noise through his helmet comms. The gray SUVs slammed on their brakes, trying to force the bikers to crash into their reinforced rear bumpers. Bulldog reacted with split-second reflexes. He swerved violently into the right lane, kicking his boot out to signal the pack. The diamond formation seamlessly morphed into a single-file line, weaving between the civilian traffic and the braking tactical vehicles, threading a needle at fatal speeds. Martha screamed as the side of a gray SUV came within inches of her knee, the sound of grinding metal echoing as one of the bikers scraped his exhaust pipes against the vehicle's armor to avoid a collision. The hitmen realized they couldn't simply block the agile motorcycles. The passenger window of the rear black SUV rolled down. A man leaned out, a suppressed automatic submachine gun leveled at the rear of the pack. The pop-pop-pop of suppressed gunfire was barely audible over the roaring engines, but the results were instantaneous. Sparks flew from the asphalt as bullets chewed into the pavement. "They're shooting!" a prospect yelled from the rear guard. "Scatter and swarm," Tommy ordered. The Hells Angels broke formation. It was a chaotic, brilliant display of outlaw riding tactics. The rear guard bikes swerved wildly, braking and accelerating in unpredictable patterns, making themselves impossible targets. Bulldog fell back, matching pace with the black SUV. He reached into his leather vest and pulled out a heavy, steel ball-peen hammer. With a guttural roar, he hurled the hammer backward with all his strength. The heavy steel head smashed directly into the center of the black SUV's windshield, spiderwebbing the safety glass and completely blinding the driver. The SUV swerved violently, its tires screeching as the driver lost control. It clipped the concrete center divider, showering the highway in sparks before spinning out across 3 lanes and violently T-boning a semi-truck trailer. The explosion of glass and metal was spectacular, taking David Briggs and his men out of the fight permanently. But the 2 gray SUVs ahead realized the target was getting away. One of them slowed down, maneuvering to ram Tommy's bike directly. "Hold on, Martha!" Tommy yelled. Tommy downshifted hard, his back tire locking up for a fraction of a second. The road glide slid sideways, shedding speed instantly. The gray SUV shot past them, its heavy steel bumper missing Tommy's front wheel by a hair's breadth. Before the driver could correct, 3 Hells Angels surrounded the vehicle. One biker pulled a heavy chain from his saddlebag and whipped it across the passenger side mirror, shattering it. Another kicked the front quarter panel, forcing the driver to overcorrect. The heavy SUV caught the lip of the asphalt shoulder at 90 miles an hour. It rolled over, flipping violently into the desert scrub brush in a cloud of dust and shredded metal. Only one vehicle remained, the lead gray SUV. But as they crested the final hill of the Cajon Pass, the vast, sprawling concrete jungle of Los Angeles came into view. And with it, the legendary, gridlocked Southern California traffic. "Traffic jam!" Bulldog signaled, laughing wildly. For a heavy, armored SUV, bumper-to-bumper traffic is a brick wall. For a pack of seasoned outlaw bikers, it's a playground. Tommy didn't slow down. "Lane split!" he yelled. The remaining Hells Angels drove their heavy bikes directly onto the white dotted line between the stalled lanes of cars. They roared between the frightened commuters, leaving the final cartel SUV trapped hopelessly behind a wall of minivans and sedans. Martha opened her eyes. The terrifying open highway had been replaced by a canyon of stopped cars. They had made it. The wolves were trapped in the cage, and the prey was gone. It took another 40 minutes of weaving through dense urban traffic before they reached the heart of downtown Los Angeles. Tommy pulled the road glide up to the heavily fortified curb outside the Federal Bureau of Investigation's regional headquarters. The remaining 7 bikers of the escort detail parked their Harleys in a tight semicircle around Tommy's bike, effectively blocking off the entrance. The sight of a heavily armed, leather-clad biker gang swarming the plaza sent federal security guards scrambling for their radios. Tommy killed the engine. The sudden silence was ringing. He reached back and gently helped Martha untangle her bruised arms from his waist. "You did it, Grandma," Tommy said, his voice surprisingly gentle as he helped her dismount. She was shaking so badly her legs almost gave out, but Tommy caught her, holding her steady. He unbuckled the helmet and pulled it off her head, revealing her sweat-soaked silver hair. "I can't believe it," Martha whispered, looking up at the towering glass and steel structure. "We're actually here." "Not quite done yet," Tommy said. He pulled the hollowed-out wooden cane from where he had strapped it to his handlebars and handed it to her. Then, he reached into his cut and pulled out the encrypted USB drive. He placed it in the palm of her bruised hand and closed her fingers over it. "You go in there. You ask for Agent Thomas Miller. You don't talk to anyone else." Martha looked at the drive, then up at Tommy. Tears welled in her pale eyes, spilling over her wrinkled cheeks. "You risked your lives for me. You don't even know me." "You asked to sit at my table, Martha," Tommy replied, a faint, rugged smile touching his lips. "In my world, that means something." Before she could respond, the heavy glass doors of the federal building burst open. 4 armed federal agents rushed out, hands resting cautiously on their holstered weapons. A tall, sharp-featured man in a crisp blue suit stepped forward. "Federal property! Step away from the building!" the lead agent shouted, eyeing the Hells Angels with deep suspicion. Martha didn't flinch. She straightened her back, leaning heavily on her grandson's wooden cane, and limped directly toward the men with the guns. "I need to speak to Agent Thomas Miller," Martha said, her voice echoing across the concrete plaza. It wasn't the terrified whisper of an old woman anymore. It was the commanding tone of a matriarch seeking justice. "Tell him Leo Sullivan's grandmother is here. And tell him I brought the ledger." The man in the blue suit froze. His eyes widened slightly. "I am Agent Miller," he said, stepping past his guards and approaching Martha quickly. Leo sent you? Where is the drive?" Martha held out her hand, opening her palm to reveal the small black device. "It's all here. Everything he died for." Miller took the drive as if it were a live grenade. He looked from the fragile grandmother to the towering, heavily tattooed sergeant-at-arms standing behind her. "How the hell did you make it past the syndicate? They had a massive dragnet out for you." Martha looked back at Tommy. "I had the best escort service in California." Miller shook his head in disbelief. He looked at Tommy Callahan, recognizing the patches, knowing exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. By the book, he should have run every biker there for warrants. "I don't know what happened out there today," Agent Miller said slowly, tucking the drive securely into his breast pocket. "But as far as I'm concerned, you boys were just taking a scenic ride through the city. I suggest you get back on the highway before local PD gets wind of this traffic stop." "Appreciate the advice, Fed," Tommy grunted. He looked at Martha one last time. He gave her a sharp, respectful nod. Martha placed her hand over her heart, a silent, profound gesture of gratitude. Tommy swung his leg over his road glide and kicked it into gear. Bulldog and the rest of the crew fired up their engines, the thunder returning to the streets of Los Angeles. As they pulled away from the curb, merging back into the endless stream of city traffic, Martha watched them until they were nothing but specks in the smoggy distance. The syndicate fell 3 weeks later. The files on Leo Sullivan's drive were a devastating roadmap of human trafficking, political corruption, and offshore accounts. The FBI raided shipping yards from Chicago to Los Angeles. Dozens of executives, corrupt officials, and cartel enforcers, including Arthur Sterling, were federally indicted. Martha Higgins never returned to the house in Barstow. She moved to a quiet, secure community in the Pacific Northwest under federal protection. But on her mantle, right next to a framed photograph of her smiling grandson Leo, she kept a heavy, Kevlar-lined motorcycle jacket. A permanent reminder that sometimes the most dangerous outlaws are the only ones willing to walk through hell to do the right thing. The story of Martha Higgins and Tommy Callahan proves that heroism doesn't always wear a badge, and angels don't always wear halos sometimes. They wear leather and ride on two wheels. When the justice system was too slow and the predators were closing in, a grieving grandmother found salvation in the most unlikely of places. It's a powerful reminder that humanity, honor, and courage can exist on both sides of the law. If this incredible true story of unexpected allies, sacrifice, and the ultimate takedown of a criminal empire kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with your friends so they can experience the adrenaline and heart of this story. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable, true-to-life dramas that prove truth is always stranger than fiction.
Hi, my name is Dominant Flame Escrow, the owner and manager of King's Obsession Concord. After watching the video, can I sit with you? A limping 70-year-old woman asked a Hells Angels biker. Then this happened. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the unexpected connection between two people who might seem very different at first glance. Stories like this remind us how easy it is to make assumptions based on appearance, age, or reputation, only to discover kindness, understanding, and humanity underneath. For me, the emotional heart of the story was seeing respect grow from a simple conversation and a willingness to treat someone with dignity. Do you think we sometimes miss meaningful connections because we judge people too quickly? And have you ever had a conversation with a stranger that changed your perspective in an unexpected way? It makes me think about how a small act of kindness, or simply taking the time to listen, can leave a lasting impression on someone's day. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy heartfelt biker stories with meaningful life lessons, feel free to like and subscribe for more whenever you'd like.